introduce Pamela. She's an assistant professor of economics at University of Toronto. Her research interests lie in the intersection between trade, industrial organization, and development economics. She has many very promising working papers, and today she will present her work on labor market power, self-employment, and development. So Pamela, thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. So I let you talk for more or less 40 minutes, interrupt you in case your co-authors are not replying to your questions, and then we leave time for the final discussion.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. Thank you, Matthew and Lavinia, for the invitation. It's great. It's great to be here. I think Francesco is on the audience, but so the questions, maybe he can look at them.
Available soon.
He's available. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So I'm gonna gear switch gears a little bit. I'm gonna talk about distortions now. This is joint work with Francesco Amorio and Monica Morlacco. This is labor market power, self-employment, and development. So our motivation starts with the fact that labor markets in low and middle income countries are substantially different to those in high income economies. And we think that in particular, they are different in ways that are related to labor market power. And why do we say this? So think about what is the environment that firms develop in. We know there is plenty of evidence that suggests that labor markets in low and middle income countries have high barriers to firm entry and firm growth. And this might give rise to the opportunity of employer concentration. On the supply side of labor, we have one unique feature of these labor markets, which is that developing countries have a huge self-employment sector, often informal, that it's an easily accessible outside option for workers. This is not the entrepreneurship that you might think in developing countries, not Silicon Valley, but this is like just like me putting my shop trying to sell t-shirts. Right? This option for workers to move between wage and self-employment leads to an upward sloping labor supply that it's a second necessary condition joined with the employer concentration to raise the existence, the possibility of labor market power. Okay. So even though we have sort of like the conditions in labor markets in low and middle income countries to have labor market power, there is not much work studying this in developing economies. There is a lot in developed ones. And so we want to fill that gap with this paper and ask two things. So we want to measure whether there is labor market power in low and middle income countries, but we want to highlight, we want to really put in the front the key role of this self-employment informal sector that we need to take into account when firms do their decisions. And then we want to think about, say, okay, so if we have labor market power, if we want to reduce that, if we want to increase wages for workers or take away that concentration of firms, what are the policies that we should consider? Is it enough to have a policy that decrease concentration? Do we want to quantify the consequences of policies aiming and reducing labor market concentration and see whether they are actually, we can just transplant recipes from developed core. So concretely, how are we going to do this? We're going to study a particular empirical setting. We're going to look at Peru between 2004 and 2011. And we are going to show you three things. So first, we're going to show you a set of stylized facts that not only are going to tell you, yes, there is labor market concentration, yes, there is a huge self-employment sector, but there are systematic relationships between the employer concentration in the wage sector, in the formal sector, if you will, and self-employment size and self-employment wages. Okay. So in order to be able to really understand the relationship between the formal wage employment and the self-employment sector, we need to understand whether there is labor market power. We need to put these stylized facts in a model. So we're going to build a tractable general equilibrium oligopsony model with endogenous entry. So market concentration is going to be endogenous in our model. And we are going to add worker sorting. And this is going to be super key because worker sorting, as you will see in the facts, is something that comes out from the data. So workers are moving from self-employment to wage employment, and we cannot just ignore that. The cool thing for us is that here, when you have these pieces together, labor market power, yes, it's positively related to employer concentration. That's not new. But it's going to be also negative related to the workers' labor supply elasticity that is pinned down by this worker sorting. So we are not going to have, and this is like just a preview, we're not going to have a clear one-to-one relationship between employer concentration and labor market power. We're going to estimate these models we're using moments from Peruvian farm and worker data, and we are going to show you 4 things. 2 takeaways that are going to be coming from the theory, and 2 for the specific case of Peru. So the first 2, which are coming from the theory, is what I just told you. The worker sorting is going to basically pin down this labor supply elasticity. It's going to give us variable markdowns in this economy. And the fact that we have worker sorting moving this elasticity, what's going to happen is that the elasticity is going to be opposing, going to be moving in a different way than how concentration leads to labor market power. So for a developing country that has a very large self-employment sector, just looking at concentration of firms is going to be a really poor measure of labor market power. For Peru, what we're going to show you is that there's labor market power, and this has important consequences. They have decreases productivity, labor productivity and wages, not only in the formal sector, but it's also decreased productivity and wages in the self-employment sector. So the consequences of labor market power are going to permeate to the other side of the economy. And then the last thing, if I have time to show you, is that once we consider, when we estimate the model, so we can have different type of policies that might be equally successful in reducing concentration. So think about decreasing fixed costs to get more firms in the market, or putting training programs so workers can go into the formal sector. Can have different policies that are exactly the same in reducing concentration, but they are going to have way different impacts on what is the effective labor market power that they deliver and what happened with other labor market aggregates. Okay, so that's sort of like the gist of the paper. We are going to sort of like talk to the literature of labor market concentration and power, of course, with lots of papers that have looked at the US mostly, a couple of exceptions that have looked at the developing countries. But I think what we want to add here is to really take seriously the fact that workers in developing countries have an outside option sector to go to. Okay? This is the self-employment informal one. Of course, the informality literature, where people have looked at informality being a cushion for like negative shocks. So we think about that this informality, informal self-employment, might be a cushion, but also shapes the labor market power of firms in the formal sector. And finally, like the more macro development literature. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the facts, just 1 slide about the data, and then I'll tell you what we find. So we're going to use basically 2 sources of data. For the first side, we're going to use the Encuesta Económica Anual, which is an annual survey for manufacturing formal firms between 2004 to 2011. You should think about this is a census of medium and large formal firms. And from this data, so this has a usual production level data. From this data is where we are going to construct our measure of concentration. So every time that I mention about concentration, we're thinking about concentration of firms in the formal sector, right? So established firms. And everything is going to be about the manufacturing sector as well. And second, we're going to use data from workers. So that we are going to use the Encuesta Nacional de Hogares, and now. So now an annual survey of households, which is a representative national regional level. We're going to have the cross-section of the same period, and we're going to also use a panel data set from 2007 to 2011 to show you some movement across formality and informality. I mean, the cool thing about this data set is that we can know where, not only what industry, what occupation the worker is in, but also whether they are employed, self-employed, and whether this self-employment is formal or informal. So we can think about informality as well. Okay. So the first fact is about employer concentration. So basically, just to summarize in a few words, there is a lot of employer concentration in Peru, way more than what people have documented for the US. So in the left panel, what you see the density number of firms. So you have 50% of the local labor market, which is a pair of an industry and a commuting zone that has only one firm. So this is a huge concentration. If you look at the right panel, which has the Herfinal index in terms of a wage bill, you see that we have 52% of markets that have a Herfinal index of 1, and they concentrate 12% of the payroll wages. So just to give you an idea of like what it should look like in the US for the paper by Berger and co-authors, so the distribution is much skewed to the left than what we see in Peru. So these levels are way high than what we see in the developed countries. So there is lots of employer concentration. So there is also lots of self-employment and informality that coexist with this employer concentration. So it's not only high, but this is a different type of self-employment. As I was saying, it's not your job in entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. That's not it. It's an informal job. So you should think about it. You have a firm, formal sector that produces t-shirts, and it's an apparel producer. And this self-employment is myself opening my little store and selling Pamela's t-shirt. So that's not paying taxes. So that's sort of like the type of self-employment that we see in Peru. And as you can see here, it's also, that means 53% of self-employed workers in manufacturing, 46% are informal. So this is a very, very also easily accessible place to go. You here see the transition matrix, whether you are employed, so you are in wage employment, self-employment. And what I want to show you here is that it's not that either you are self-employed and you will never be employed for a firm, or the opposite. But there is actually a lot of movement between being employed and being self-employed. So if you focus on the four numbers here on the bottom right, so what you see is more or less 18% of people that are employed at time T will be self-employed at time T plus 1. So in a lapse of 1 year, 18% of the employee workers will go to self-employment. So these transitions are much higher than what people have documented for developed economies, in order like 4 times much higher. So workers are moving, in fact, from wage employment to self-employment. We also find that when they move in the same industry. So I was before a worker for an apparel firm, and then today I decide to open my own tiny shop, and so on. So they don't move outside what the do-it industry. So this is a very big self-employment sector. It's readily accessible, and it turns out that these two things are correlated. So it's not by chance that we have huge self-employment and we have huge concentration. And to show you this, we have a regression that basically have outcomes at the worker level. We regress that several outcomes with the concentration index that we have at the local labor market, lots of individual controls and fixed effect by industry and time. We can instrument that, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna show you what we find in the relationships. So what we find is that when you have local labor markets that have huge employment concentration or a large employment concentration, yes, we should expect that wages for employees are going to go down. That's exactly what sort of like labor market power does, it depresses wages. So this we expected. What we didn't expect is that effect also permeates to the self-employment sector. Right? So this is concentration in the formal sector. It also has effect of depressing wages, and even more so for the self-employed workers. Not only has depresses wages in both sectors, but also increases the size of the self-employment sector. And depresses, if you think about schooling, years of schooling as a measure of abilities of workers, depresses schooling or abilities in both sectors, both in the employer concentration as well as self-employed. The effects are robust if you do the IPS strategy. But basically, what we want to highlight here is that we have these three facts. So we have high levels of concentration, have high levels of self-employment rates, which is a particular self-employment that we have in these countries. And then these two things are related. We have a systematic relationship between employment concentration and the self-employment sector. So here, when we look at this, we say, no, we cannot just consider labor market power, looking at just uniquely employing concentration. We need to take seriously the self-employment sector. In order to do that, we need a model. So we're gonna use these three facts to inform how do we construct a model. So for instance, to create these high levels of concentrations, of course, we're gonna have fixed cost of entry in the production sector. We need to have this endogenous entry to think about why do we have high self-employment rates. We need, and then why people are moving so easily across these two sectors. We need to have sorting of workers across ways and self-employment. And in order to capture this systematic relationship, we need to have some worker heterogeneity where ability is going to be endogenous to sort. So I see a lot of questions. I don't know if Francesco is answering them.
Francesco is really active,
but this is
in
okay. Okay. So if there are no more questions about the empirical part, I'm going to go to a model. So okay, so just to give you a hint of what is a model, we're going to have a traditional oligopsony model, which is just think about the models that people have used to think about labor market power in developed countries. So that part is not going to be new. We're going to sort of like extend those, adding endogenous entry, because we do care about how policies changes the number of firms in the industry. But the really, really new thing that we're going to do is we're going to combine them with worker sorting across these two sectors, and we're going to see how that worker sorting shape how firms take decisions when they are oligopsonist. Okay. So in the environment, we're going to have a continuum of manufacturing local labor markets. Okay, so these are indexed by K. We're going to have some individuals in these local labor markets, and we're going to have an integer number of formal firms. So this integer number of formal firms is going to be sort of like why firms have labor market power, because there is only going to be a small set of firms that compete with for labor in that local labor market. How the population is going to be exogenous for us, but the number of firms that exist is going to be endogenous, and this is key to be able to do counterfactuals. We're going to have some fixed entry costs that are going to basically cut the number of firms and make it integers. So what a worker can do, worker can be employed in one of these formal firms, and they will earn a wage, WF for formal, or they can be self-employed, and they can earn this wage of earning of WS. In the local labor market, we're going to have Cournot competition for labor, so that a small number of firms are going to compete Cournot for workers, but they are going to be just perfectly competitive in the output market. Okay, so we think about like sort of like there is a national market for these goods. The demand, we're going to have like a Cobb Douglas aggregator for goods of all the local labor markets the consumers are going to get. And within each local labor market, there are going to be two varieties. So the variety for the formal sector and variety for the self-employed sector. So here, what you should think about, how do you think about this variety? You go in your locality to buy a t-shirt, and you have the option to buy or to buy a shoe, and you have the option to buy Nike, or you have the option to buy Pamela's. Okay, so that's sort of like what you should be thinking of varieties. We have a CS form and Cobb Douglas form, so we can recover very easily the consumer expenditures on each variety. Where do we put the worker sorting here? So every worker is going to be born with two draws of ability. So an ability, which is going to be effective units of labor, to go for the formal sector or to go for the self-employment sector. Okay, and these are going to be governed by this distribution G. Of course, they are going to decide to work in the formal firm sector if they get more income for working there than what they do work in self-employment, and the reverse. This inequality goes the other way. With this, we can integrate this G function, and we can create the effective labor supply for sector F. So the sorting will give the labor supply that firms will take into account. But something else, the sorting will also create that the elasticity of labor supply is already positive, which is one condition for labor market power to sort of like exist. Okay. So worker selection is going to give us this upward sloping labor supply. What is our technology? So self-employed workers are basically going to just have a very simple linear production function. For the formal sector, these firms are going to be homogeneous in each local labor market, just for simplicity. There is going to be some market level productivity here. Oops. And we can aggregate whatever they produce for a particular variety in this way. Okay, so how many are going to be there? There is going to be some fixed free entry condition, fixed entry cost. I'm not going to go that in detail. So self-employed, they price at a marginal cost. Firms do not price, firms have a more complicated problem. So when they maximize, they are going to take into account that their wages do change their labor supply. Okay, so they are going to take into account that their actions actually changes what workers do. So we're going to have some labor supply elasticity terms. We're going to have some market structure, and we're going to have market that appear when firms compete at a curve. Okay, so for sake of the presentation, just assume that this alpha is equal to 1. What this is going to give us is that wages are not going to be equal to the marginal revenue product of labor, but are going to be equal to that over some thing that we call a markdown. Okay, so firms are paying less than workers than the marginal revenue product of labor. So what is that markdown? It has this simple expression where it depends on the number of firms in the market, concentration, and it depends on this elasticity of labor supply, which doesn't come from the firm problem, but comes from the worker sorting problem. Okay, so there are going to be two sources of labor market power. Just one key thing about this first order condition, so we can actually check whether what we are doing in the data what we're doing is right. We can construct in a very simple way this wedge, this markdown from the data, looking at the value elasticity of labor and the value added share of labor expenditures. And we're using the data, so this is the distribution of the markdown from the data. And you see first, there are clearly greater than 1, so there are markdowns in this economy. And it's very heterogeneous. So we have variable markdowns in the data. The other thing that it's, I think, cool, it's here, is that in the models where you don't have sorting, where you only have a Cournot, this markdown should depend monotonically with a share of payroll of the firms. As you see here, this is not related necessarily monotonic with this share. So that's something that points out that there is something else that is opposing just the simple oligopsonistic part. And basically, we check also this theory of variable markdown. So we construct these elasticities, these implied elasticities from the model. And what you can see is that they relate negatively with this W, which is telling you that a direct effect of concentration, which is decreasing this markdown, it's going to be opposed to an indirect effect, which is you have higher wages, you have a decreasing elasticity that actually increases the markdown. So the sorting and the oligopoly go in different directions. So the first thing that I want you to, maybe I don't have that much time, but in the first thing that theoretically I want you to highlight is when you have the model, when you really take seriously this worker sorting, concentration and labor market power are not one-to-one related. This link, it's broken. The second thing, and we're not gonna go deep into this, is that the ability distribution in the sorting problem has very interesting implications about what's going to happen with labor productivity in each sector. For instance, if these abilities are positively correlated and you have more dispersion in the self-employment sector, well, what you get is that labor productivity decreases in both sectors with labor market power. But if this is not the case, it might be that decreases in the self-employment sector and it increases in the wage employment sector. So what's going to happen with average wages, what's going to happen with labor productivity, and what's going to happen eventually with firm productivity, when you have sorting, it's going to critically depend on what you find in this sorting mechanism. That's the second theoretical implication. So I'm not gonna go deep into the estimation, but we estimate in 3 steps this problem. We have the worker's ability. We estimate it with a procedure by Heckman and Sedalek. We have a CMM procedure for a couple of things in terms of like firms, productivity, and fixed entry cost. And the other parameters we have using the model restrictions, we identify them. These are the moments, so we are still fine-tuning some of the moments of the model and data. We are getting there. Okay, so in the final, how much do we have? 3 minutes.
So it's a bit less than 15 minutes.
Okay. No, so I think really on time to have discussion later. So what we want to do with the estimated model is say like, okay, but okay, fine, but why is it important? So what we want to do is we want to show you 2 things. So the first thing is we want to show you exactly what I mentioned before, that when you have the self-employment sector and you have sorting of workers between wage employment and self-employment, saying there is a lot of market concentration does not necessarily imply that there is a lot of labor market power. Okay, so what you can see here is our baseline estimation. See, this is a CDF, right? You have the blue line, it's our baseline estimation. So that's market concentration in our baseline estimation. What you see markdowns, which is a measure of labor market power. The blue line here, it's not necessarily monotonic. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what do we do with policies? So what can policies help us reduce labor market power and increase wages of workers in the wage sector as well as the self-employment? So what we did is the following exercise. So let's say we have 3 things that we can manipulate in a model. So we have fixed costs, which are the thing that basically firms have to pay in order to enter the market. So think about regulation fees or anything that any fee that a firm has to pay in order to create the enterprise, that these are going to be heterogeneous across markets. So we have that. We have also market productivity, which is the C. So think about creating a road, giving electricity, rural electrification. So that will increase the day-to-day activity, the day-to-day productivity of activities of firms. So that's the other thing that we can move with policies. And the final thing that we can move with policies is this G function here, which is the ability that workers have to work in the formal or informal sector. And for that, think about training programs that are very popular in Latin America to help young people to go from self-employed or to go from informality to formality. Okay. So these are the 3 sort of like type of policies that we're comparing. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to move these 3 parameters such that we reduce concentration in the same way. So what you're seeing here is basically, we're going to move all these policies such that we have lower concentration, but exactly the same in all of them, more or less. Okay, so we are moving these parameters to have a decreasing in average market concentration. So what happened with labor market power? And this is what it's going to be key. It's that reducing concentration via these 3 different policies does not have the same implication on reducing markdowns, does not translate into reducing markdowns. In fact, the only policy that translates in actually reducing market power is decreasing fixed costs. So allowing more firms to enter into these local labor markets. This, if you, in our empirical context, if you do training of abilities of workers to be able to be more productive in the formal sector, you are actually going to be increasing the labor market power of these firms. If you do increases in market productivity, for a set of firms, nothing is going to change. But for firms that were already pretty market power-ish, they are going to become, they're going to have even more market power. So the effect of policies here in concentration are going to be very different. So it's important we think it's important to really take into account the self-employment sector, because the effects are way different. We can also look at the effect on wages. I'm not going to go into that, but also, I mean, these are very tiny figures. But basically what you see is, again, the fixed cost policy is the better policy, in which this is the policy that increases wages the most for both the wage sector as well as the self-employment sector. The other ones basically are not useful. Okay, so then and this is what I have today, so I'm going to conclude. So what we want to show you in this paper is, first, we want to show you new stylist facts about labor market power in low and middle income countries. So particularly that employer concentration relates systematically to the features of the self-employment sector. So you cannot try to study labor market power without including the dynamics with the self-employment sector. To understand that, we built this general equilibrium model. We have non-atomistic firms competing for labor, and we have this particularly important worker sorting across wage and self-employment. We think we bring to the table some new insights on the role of concentration. So particularly what I just mentioned, policies that are equally successful in reducing concentration, which governments might think this is the way to go, might have different effects in actual labor market power and wages. So we think that it's understanding what is labor market power in low-income countries it's necessary before we have any policy design to decrease or raise this distortion. And I think that's what I have.
Thanks a lot, Pamela. I think that during your presentation, especially in the
I see the chat.
The last minute, you got very interesting questions. So I would like to invite who asked to and bring them back to this panel discussion. So especially
I'm going to put that slide.
Jonas and Giovanni Perarolo.
Sure. I have a lot of questions about this paper because I find it super interesting. I guess in a sense, I think, you know, this question is maybe coming from me having a prior of labor markets functioning less like those in rich countries in Peru than maybe some others have as a prior. But I guess the way that you guys model sorting and upward sloping labor supply, I'm curious if this, I mean, it's a very reasonable, I don't mean to say that I have sort of an alternative proposal for how to model the labor market. But I still think that it's something that, you know, to fully believe, I would need to see empirical evidence that's not just cross-sectional on this for a setting like Peru. I mean, because after all, it is the case that kind of sorting and the upper sloping labor supply implications does imply a labor market that in some ways is quite similar to maybe not old school, but at least modern textbooks of economics. I guess, you know, for example, I guess one reason I was curious about this is that if I understand correctly, an important assumption is that you have to pay all your workers the same wage. So I guess I'm just curious if it's somehow, even if it would be from like a case study of a small subset of firms or kind of more anecdotal evidence, I would be very curious to sort of see.
So we have done a couple of things, but I think maybe also I will throw some ideas what you think that we could do. So I think the reason why we go with sorting are like, for instance, as opposed of like a certain matching model, which I think might be the other competing stories. So the first thing is that what strikes us the most is to see these very, very large numbers in the transition matrices that we see. When these transition matrices, we take the panel data we have from now, and then we have the workers, and they tell you whether are they employed or self-employed, which industry, and we follow them. It's true that we have a limit, so we're trying to collect more rolling panels to be able to dig a little deeper in things. But the fact that we have 17% or sorry, 18% of workers that are employees at Hanti that will become next year self-employed, and then you have 16% of people that are self-employed that will become employees next year. So I mean, this percentage are very large, and these are year-to-year movement. So that's one thing that we think there is this worker sorting, because models with a certain matching will not give you that quick movement. So people will move, but it will not give you this immediate and high transition numbers. The second thing is that I really like your idea of like going maybe to give some examples. So one thing that we could do when we have more data on these panels is to look at occupations. Because so right now, if we have occupations, then we really don't have much power to do things. But you could think about that within occupations that are like just like productive occupations that might be more similar to the one that you do when you are self-employed, to see whether there is much heterogeneity on wages, but to know whether we need to include more skills there, and to see whether the movement, the transition between once you restrict to this set of people that have comparable occupations between employees and self-employment, still we have these huge transitions that we can do. We need a little bit more data. The other thing that why we didn't go to, we sort of like are pushing for this selection or sorting instead of like going to search and matching, is that the other thing that we found interesting is that we don't see much unemployment here. So the spells where you are not doing anything are nothing really, like workers, people work. And I think it's exactly because you have this self-employment is not, as I said, you are a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Self-employment is that I need to work and I put my shop. I don't pay taxes, I sell my t-shirts. So that's why you don't have that unemployment. The search and matching models are very good, also matching these spells of unemployment. We just don't see that in the data. So that's a couple of things that we do. I think we need to do more. I think this is a key, as Jonas, I completely agree, this is a key thing that we need to support in the model. But I'm keen to hear like more ideas about this. But yes, this is a fair point.
We still have time for a short question.
Can I just follow up on Jonas' point? Because I think, I mean, you're right that, so the thing is the ability distribution that we estimate should give, so does give predictions in terms of, how the marginal worker that is drawn into wage employment as the wage employment sector expands, how that compares to the existing wage workers. So, if you had like if you could look at the same local labor market as the wage employment sector expands, you should see that the marginal worker that is drawn into wage employment should be of higher than average ability with respect to the existing wage workers, and lower than average ability with respect to those that stay self-employed. So, you know, there could be a way to kind of validate those estimates looking at the time series. The problem is that, you know, we don't have a lot of time variation basically in the span of data that we have, I think. So we do see that in the cross section, but what you would like to see this in the time series, I agree with you. That would be a nice way to validate, but we just don't have that kind of variation right now. Maybe perhaps if we zoom into, you know, one region that experienced particular growth, I guess that's what you were saying when you were talking about case studies and so on. We might think about that. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pamela, and for
Thank you so much, guys.